guys, welcome to our next episode of Just For You, the podcast with all things feminist and legal. I'm your host, Ann Scales. Today we'll be discussing something some of our listeners may already be familiar with, feminist jurisprudence. But for those of you that don't know, I just wanted to briefly explain what feminist jurisprudence is. It's a philosophy of law based on the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. Before we start, just a quick shout out to our Twitter page, Just For You. Make sure you guys go check it out. On today's episode, I'm being joined by fellow feminists and key figures in feminist jurisprudence, Catherine McKinnon and Martha Albertson-Feynman.
Thanks for having us, Anne. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I'm with Catherine. You've been so influential in the law community as a forerunner for feminism. I'm just curious, Anne, how'd you become involved with feminist jurisprudence and law in general?
So I graduated from Harvard Law School and was a professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law for 18 years. I was a member of the committee that put together the Celebration 25, which was a party and conference held in 1978 to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the first woman to graduate from Harvard Law School.
Wow, that's awesome.
It was actually while planning this event that I came up with the term feminist jurisprudence. I have written many essays on the need for feminist jurisprudence as well as explaining what it is about. I was also part of the R versus Butler case that went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it moved feminists forward. I have also only worked pro bono since 1980.
I also have some experience as a professor. I've taught at the University of Wisconsin, Columbia University, and Cornell. And in 1984, I founded the Feminism and Legal Theory Project, which aims to address issues with women in law, as well as the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative as part of the curriculum at Emory University as of 2008.
What about you, Catherine? How did you get started in this field?
Well, I have a JD and a doctorate in political sciences from Yale Law School. While I was in graduate school, I created the first course in what became Yale's Women's Studies program. I have published many works that primarily focus on sexual abuse in the context of inequality, and I have been a visiting professor at universities including York, Chicago, Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, before tenuring at the University of Michigan.
While I love hearing about how we all got caught up in this amazing career in theory, I really want to talk about some recent legal cases that could use a different perspective, more specifically being viewed from a feminist lens.
I'm excited to hear about what you all think, but I also think it's important to acknowledge that we only play a small role in the community of women across the world.
Absolutely. As white women in a position of privilege, we only have a page in a much larger story.
Yes, feminist jurisprudence is amazing because it prevents sexist victimization by emphasizing a female perspective, it encourages cooperation, not competition, and it asks a practice of law that takes into consideration different aspects of people's lives. But it also has some weaknesses, like many other things in life. As we all know, everyone is different, and the same goes for feminists and their ideas. When it comes to certain subjects like pornography, there's often the debate of empowering versus degrading. Sometimes feminist jurisprudence can exclude certain minorities depending on the person practicing the theory and their own sense of self. Sometimes it clashes with religion too. Tradition may say that women are meant to submit to their husbands, and in a legal system created by people of faith, some of these unfavorable ideologies have carried over into law. And last, but certainly not the least important, some people don't even believe in a patriarchy, which needless to say can make the attempt to popularize feminist jurisprudence quite difficult.
Definitely, I have to agree with you there. But moving along, Martha, would you like to start us off on the case of R.V. Barden?
Sure, so just a warning for our listeners before I begin, this case does revolve heavily around sexual assault and murder, so if you aren't comfortable with that, this episode might not be for you. The case I'm going to be discussing is R.V. Barden, which went to trial in 2015 and was appealed in 2018. Cindy Gladue was an Indigenous sex worker who was on the job when she met truck driver Bradley Barden. Barden employed Gladue's services for 2 nights in a row. On the second night, Gladue was under the influence of alcohol when Barden attempted to engage her in rough sexual activities like he had on the first night they were together. Gladue was drunk and did not consent, but Barden ignored this fact and brutally assaulted her multiple times throughout the evening. Gladue was found deceased in the morning, lying in a bathtub. She had died of blood loss caused by internal wounds to her genitals. Barden called emergency services and fabricated stories to explain her death, none of which were true. He went to trial for first-degree murder and manslaughter in 2015.
This is such a sad story. So how do you think this case involves feminist jurisprudence or needs that legal practice involved?
As you may know, I developed the vulnerability theory in the 1990s. I believe that within society, some people are far more underprivileged than others. This places certain minorities in vulnerable positions where they are overrun by more powerful institutions, which is especially true with law currently being practiced. Cindy Gladue was definitely a vulnerable member. She was Indigenous, a woman, a sex worker, the list goes on. Believe it or not, Barden was actually acquitted of all charges in the initial 2015 trial, despite having admitted to actions that directly caused Gladue's death. Now, I'm of the personal belief that this outcome is partially determined by a lack of rape shield laws. For those who don't know, these laws should have prevented the jury from hearing any details about Gladue's sex life that could have harmed her credibility. Had they been used in the trial, the jury's view of Gladue would have been more than just her sexuality. They may have begun to see her as a person. While I do think the introduction of these laws would have been useful in attaining justice for Cindy, as we figures in the feminist jurisprudence theory must acknowledge, Gladue's ethnic and cultural background probably influenced the jury, as stereotypes surrounding the Indigenous community often revolve around negative connotations. The culmination of Gladue's minority status in a multitude of arenas is a vital reason for why feminist jurisprudence needs to be implemented in cases where the vulnerable need it the most.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. As you know, I have done extensive work focusing on the legal and societal issues surrounding the sex industry, which I'm afraid to say is a form of sex discrimination that promotes and validates the exploitation and abuse of women. Cindy Gladue was most definitely a victim of the sex discrimination that appears while working in this industry. The fact that Gladue was employed in this industry should not justify the violent means of her death are any less horrific, and that the perpetrator should be held any less accountable. The facts of this case are that Gladue did not give her consent for Barton to perform sexual activities with her on the second night, and thus Barton is guilty of raping and murdering this woman. There need to be protective laws set in place for these women so that they can do their jobs without fearing repercussions and violence against them. The stereotypes and discrimination against this industry, I feel, were the primary factors in acquitting Barton from his horrific actions.
Thank you for sharing. I always love hearing other perspectives. I think we also talked about another case with similar themes that could definitely benefit from a feminist mindset. Anne, would you mind letting us know a little more about that case?
Yeah, of course. So this is another sexual assault case, but it did not reach the Supreme Court of Canada. A 19-year-old woman was raped over a bathroom sink at a house party. The problem with this case is actually the judge, Robin Camp. He seemed to have a lot of advice to give to the rapist and had a lot of comments for the woman. He asked the woman, quote, why didn't she screw her pelvis or push her bottom into the sink to avoid penetration, end quote. He also wondered, quote, why couldn't you just keep your knees together, end quote. The advice he gave to the rapist was, I want you to tell your friends, your male friends, that they have to be far more gentle with women, that they have to be far more patient, and they have to be very careful. To protect themselves, they have to be very careful. This advice was given after the judge acquitted the man. He also voiced to the general public, quote, some sex and pain go sometimes together. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as well as young women want to have sex, particularly if they're drunk.
Wow, that's truly horrible. I can already tell that feminist jurisprudence is a necessity here, but maybe you can touch on that further.
This shows the need for feminist jurisprudence because had the judge been taught about these issues and how to handle them, this case would have gone a different way. Thankfully, through appeal, the victim was ordered a new trial. Even the Canadian Bar Association says law schools should acknowledge certain basic realities as uncontroversial. The fact that we live in a society structured by relations of power that are organized on the intersecting basis of racism, sexism, and class exploitation, which are in turn supported by the law, could be one such basic reality. Had the judge been taught feminist jurisprudence, he definitely would have not been making the comments he had made. This case also shows how even though the man committed the crime, the woman was questioned more on why she did not try to escape. This enforces the idea that still in today's society men have more power than women.
Martha, what do you think about this case and its need for feminist jurisprudence?
I think this case again highlights a need for education in our legal system surrounding sexual assault. Had this judge been aware of feminist jurisprudence and its attempts to alleviate sexist, patriarchal views in a court of law, he may have better understood the victim's vulnerability in regards to her attack. She was young, scared, and a woman who was very likely weaker than her attacker. Because of her vulnerability, she should have been supported in court and had some understanding casted towards her, not been berated and humiliated at an extremely vulnerable time for her.
I totally agree. Last but certainly not least, I know that you have a case that you're very passionate about, Catherine.
Sure. This is the case of Jansen versus Platy Enterprises. The reason this case is one I am very passionate about because it employs my legal claim that sexual harassment in the workplace is in fact sex discrimination. In this case, two waitresses, Diana Jansen and Tracy Govero, complained that they were being sexually harassed by the restaurant's cook, Tommy Gramis. The Board of Adjudication ruled in their favor and found that Platy Enterprises, the owners of the restaurant, were liable for discrimination and awarded compensation to the two women. On appeal, however, the Manitoba Court of Queen's Branch upheld the decision but reduced the amount awarded because they felt that since only some women are subjected to sexual harassment, not all, it is not discrimination because of sex, rather because of individual characteristics, their physical attractiveness. However, the Supreme Court overturned this decision as they found it key that only female employees were at risk of being sexually harassed. Thus, the court ruled that harassment is in fact a form of sex discrimination because it is unwelcome and negatively affects the work environment, which can lead to many consequences for the victim. They also found Platy Enterprises liable. This case was pivotal as it overturned the decision of the Manitoba Court of Appeal, which previously had found that sexual harassment was not sex discrimination, as per Section 6 of the Manitoba Human Rights Act. It set precedents in the Canadian legal system and allowed us to view sexual harassment as a violation of human rights, which it was not previously viewed as. This is a classic way that feminist jurisprudence has showed its importance in the world, and it shows the immediate need for legal systems to open up to this theory and incorporate it into its writings.
Absolutely. Anne, do you want to dive a little deeper into this topic?
I think, as Catherine mentioned, this case is extremely important as it sets precedents for future cases. This case shows why I started the feminist jurisprudence movement. Everyone is different, and these differences need to be acknowledged, especially in law. One must be able to acknowledge that certain differences are important and that not everybody can be treated the same way. It is a fact that women are more likely to be sexually harassed. Thus, this precedence is important as it shows that the Supreme Court of Canada is finally understanding these differences.
I loved hearing the thoughts of other women who have spearheaded the amazing theory of feminist jurisprudence.
I couldn't agree more.
Me too. I just want to thank you both for joining me here today, as well as our listeners for joining in. To keep up to date with all things Just For You and everything new with feminist jurisprudence, follow our Twitter, Just For You podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.